Okay, next up we'll have Tom Tanton. He's a fellow in energy studies at Pacific Research Institute, and he'll be speaking to us today. The title will be Are California's Global Warming Policies a Model for the Nation? I hope the answer is no.
You all know the answer to the question of the title, but there's an important reason that I pose that question. I'm going to go through a little bit of the details. So when you're talking to your congressmen, your elected representatives, people in your state house, you'll have some real-world experience from California. Now, I'm also here to a degree to be living proof that not everyone in California is a raving lunatic.
Some people have left.
Many people have left, yes. Unfortunately, many of those people that have left are the innovative, creative people that would have otherwise got us out of this problem. Let's see, what are we going to do here?
What's F5 to bring it up?
F5. There we go. Alrighty. Tom from the state of high technology. What I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the experiences we've encountered in implementing AB 32. Now, originally I thought AB 32 simply stood for Assembly Bill number 32. It was passed in 2006. It requires the state to reduce its greenhouse gases, and we're going through a lot of turmoil in implementing those policies, and I'll discuss some of the turmoil. But I want you guys to understand the difference between unintended consequences and unanticipated consequences. They were told all these things were going to happen. They didn't intend them to happen, but they were forewarned. They should have anticipated them. The other thing about AB 32, you know, we're the land of high tech and kids texting messages, and you can't read a text message unless you've got the glossary. But I've come to realize that AB is just shorthand for abomination. What it says is we're going to reduce our greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2020, and then further on by 80% by 2050. We adopted, embraced, endorsed a target. 427 million metric tons would be the emissions in the year 2020. That's 30% reduction from what would have been forecast for that year if the regulators actually knew what happened in 1990. Well, a dirty little secret is I was one of those regulators back in 1990, and we didn't know what the hell we were doing. So that's the inventory of greenhouse gases for the base year of 1990 is no better than anybody's guess. And that's what we did in many cases. We guessed. The good news is it taught me about life cycle analysis. I know how they make soda glass. I know how they make cement. I also know that it takes 5.5 years of operation of a wind turbine to offset the CO2 emissions just from the extra cement used in building wind turbines. Because they've got this, imagine balancing a school bus on top of a telephone pole. Well, that's kind of a mechanical difficulty, and that's exactly what they're doing. So they've got these huge concrete foundations. The other thing about wind turbines, and I'm digressing, but I'll get back to the point here in a minute. The wind blows, the wind doesn't blow. You know, it's up and down. Well, guess what? The base load, the base backup units that Ken and other folks were talking about, well, they're doing the same thing. What does your car mileage do when you're stuck in stop and go traffic, accelerating, decelerating, accelerating, decelerating, stop, go? Your mileage goes to hell. Same thing happens to power plants. They have what's called a heat rate penalty for ramping. Well, that heat rate penalty for ramping, when they're up and down and up and down and up and down, can be as much as 40%. So if you're operating steady state at 10,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour, now you're forced into ramping mode because all these wind turbines are so fickle. Guess what? Your heat rate is up at 14,000 BTUs a kilowatt hour. You're producing less kilowatt hours and burning more fuel and emitting more CO2. If it's just a little bit of wind in your system, you know, 1 or 2%, it's kind of like the load following you get when you're following demand. But when you put in 20%, like Mr. Pickens wants to do, it destroys achievement of your ultimate goal. Now, the reason this is important for all of you who don't live in California, we've got Pelosi, Boxer, Waxman, and the president all saying, do what California did. And Arnold, yeah, well, he's termed out and can't run for national office of import anyway, so there's good news. There's more good news coming down the road as well. But everybody's saying, do what California did. I documented some of the problems with this in a paper I did last year for Competitive Enterprise Institute, and it is available on their website. Basically, is California a good model, or cautionary tales from California? The same thing's happening now with respect to climate change. And we have experienced the pain of these abominations. In terms of history, the CARB adopted a scoping plan last December. It includes 3 mechanisms. They couldn't decide who to gore, so to speak. So they're going to have direct regulations. If you own a cement kiln, thou shalt emit no more than. They're going to institute a cap and trade, and they're going to create the Western Climate Initiative. Now, I understand the good folks in Arizona are talking about backing out of that. Utah is talking about about backing out. Washington and Oregon are talking about not getting in. So the 11 Western states that represent the WECC, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, half of them are bailing or seriously talking about. And for the remainders, they're likely to follow the situation on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative up here, which is, hey, guess what? Violates the Constitution. States cannot enter into compacts with each other without congressional approval. This walks like, talks like, and smells like a compact to anybody that's looked at it. It is a compact. And you might want to take that to your house and say, we can't do this anyway. Assembly Bill 32 also required the California Air Resources Board to undertake an economic analysis of the proposal, of the scoping plan. What's it going to cost us and what are the benefits going to be? Well, not too surprisingly, they found we were going to make money doing it. Even though our productivity was going to be driven down, even though we were going to charge higher prices for everything. But the interesting thing, in California we have an office in the legislature, nonpartisan, sort of a mix of economists and accountants, that look at things, and they analyzed the economic analysis produced by the Air Resources Board. Well, you know, a group of economists and accountants are usually probably pretty discreet in how they describe things. Words like cheating, intentionally misled, intentionally left out, were all throughout the Legislative Analyst's Office. But what I find humor in, the ARB also hired some noted university economists to look at it. And they came to the same conclusion. Their own peer reviewers slammed the economic analysis. What I've been telling our legislators is something a little different, you know. I knew they were going to do it wrong, but there was going to be plenty of people pointing that out. But they used it in the wrong way. They used it as a justification tool. And having spent 40 years in California policy, not politics, policy, that's not what the models are supposed to be used for. They should have used it as a design improvement tool. All right, we've got a scoping plan. What are the costs? What are the sensitivities and stuff? And then said, all right, now how can we make it better? And here's an example. Much of the economic savings, making money, that they came up with were from various energy efficiency measures. Consumers are going to save more money than from paying a little more for the appliance or the light bulb or whatever it is. So I said, well, if that's true, why don't you just publish a catalog of activities people can undertake instead of adding on so much in terms of administrative costs, compliance costs, police costs, and all this other stuff. If in fact people can make money, most rational people will do it. You don't need a law to, I think only in California do they pass a law that says, thou shalt be smart. The other problem is it's gotten into a dueling models problem. We've got everybody with their model that says it's going to cost anywhere up to $500 billion. And CARB, on the other hand, saying, well, we're going to make $2 billion. Now, this is over, 30-year period. Well, with all due respect to the legislators, the difference in models are of such complexity that you just can't understand why the two models would come up with different answers. Well, every single input affects every other single intermediate thing, and you can make any model say anything. So they have to rely on the officialdom answer of we're going to save. Well, that's not what the models should be doing in the first place. Follow California. As I mentioned, the president and congressional leaders have asserted that we're going to do an HR version of Assembly Bill 32. We're going to impose a low carbon fuel standard on the nation, and I'll get into what that means in a bit. This is why it's important. When I finally decide to leave California, I want somewhere sane to go. I may be the last one there. I mean, Mr. McClintock, he escaped. He had to get elected to Congress to do it, but there are escape routes. We're the only state with a larger ex-migration than immigration. And that's even accounting for the illegal immigration that we have in California, which is pretty significant. We're still losing people faster than we're gaining them. That's particularly distressing to me because that is that many fewer brains that can solve whatever dilemma we're faced with. Current situation, we just passed 10.4% unemployment late last week, and that's not good. Foreclosures are among the highest in the nation. Part of the reason, you always hear this story that California's per capita energy consumption has remained flat. Why don't we build our, do DSM and everything else like California? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is our real estate prices were way up here. So what do we have? In LA, we had 3-4 families in a house, a single family house. Our persons per household in all the econometric models for demand were over 3. The national average is about 2.5. Well, of course, you're going to use less energy to heat and light your homes if you just squish more people in your homes. It was interesting, earlier we heard from Barun Mehta from India. Well, and I mentioned to him after he spoke that California and India have just signed an agreement. It's not a treaty, it's an agreement to share mechanisms for saving energy. And I'm trying to figure out, because the California leaders are hell-bent to reduce our standard of living in California to that of the Indians, while the Indians are trying to raise their standard of living to us. And maybe we'll meet somewhere in the middle. You probably heard in the news we had a problem with the state budget, and we couldn't make it balance. Mr. McClintock last session, 08, was one of the few folks that said this budget that we're passing back in August is not balanced. We're going to hit a train wreck coming, and he was proved right. And then they couldn't figure out what to do, so they raised taxes. I told them there's a real simple solution to this. Keep tax rates the same. Suspend AB 32. AB 32 has an emergency suspension provision in it. If the governor declares an emergency, physical, natural disaster, anything, he can say delay implementation. Right? Just delay implementation, let the economy grow like it had been. Guess what? At the current tax rate, corporate tax rate in California, that would have paid off the deficit in 5 years, just by letting the economy grow. Well, California is kind of a blue state. That didn't go over too well. We also have the 4th highest electricity prices in the country. Gasoline, we're number 3. Continental, we're number one. The interesting thing, people talk about how important California is. We're the 8th largest economy in the world. If we were counted as a separate country. Yeah, but 15 years ago we were bragging about being number 5. Now we're number 8, and that's something to brag about? They're going the wrong way. I mentioned that there's at least a $510 billion hit to the economy, less than 0.5% reduction in global emissions. And that's just anthropogenic emissions, not, all of them. There are a few sectors in California that might benefit. The movie making, tracking the carbon credits, and things like that. But the most fundamental reason California's energy consumption has been relatively flat is we simply and fundamentally changed our economy. We don't make a damn thing in California anymore. We do grow a lot of food, but we're primarily a service-oriented economy. Service-oriented economies, banking, finance, internet, software development, stuff like that, are very energy unintensive. But our total consumption has increased. And it's interesting that most of the growth has actually occurred in coal and nuclear from our sane neighbors in Arizona, and Nevada, and Utah. Let me talk a little bit about low carbon fuel standards. Basically what it says is transportation fuel has to be 10% less carbon in it. Well, that's easy. Put your water in your tank. That's what they're proposing. Not only lower carbon fuel, but lower energy content fuel. Put in ethanol. Well, so guess what? They're doing an economic analysis of the low carbon fuel standard. And guess what the answer is going to be? We're going to save millions. But there's not enough of that around. And then they do these counterproductive things. Because one of the fuels they want to rely on for the low carbon fuel standard is natural gas, and CNG and buses and stuff. Well, we've got vast areas of natural gas. They happen to be in an area called offshore California, and it has to be associated with petroleum. So they're cutting their nose to spite their face. If we can't drill for natural gas, we can't drill for oil. I mean, the life cycle analysis does require, the low carbon fuel standard does require life cycle analysis, which is the right idea. From the well to the wheel. But it's an accounting nightmare. To do it right would require millions and millions of chemists and spectroscopists. Well, I'm a chemist and a spectroscopist, but I don't want to do that. I don't think any other chemist would either, right? All right.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. There's also a lot of standards already in place for the infrastructure for transportation fuels. You got to have a certain Reid vapor pressure. And while it's different in Phoenix area in the summertime than it is in Los Angeles in the wintertime. And all these different fuel standards determine the formulation, and fiddling around with it is a bad idea. And then, oh, by the way, you've got seals and gaskets on the pumps and all these different things that are affected differently by ethanol than they are from gasoline. So you may hear a question, what about the ethanol's industry for calling for increases in ethanol content above the 10%? Don't do it. Or, don't do it to my vehicle. Well, fortunately, I live on a cattle ranch and drive big diesel trucks everywhere, so they're not gonna screw with me. So they're doing these things that are counterproductive to their own goals, even though climate change is the most important. It's more important than clean air and water. It's more important than feeding the poor. It's more important than keeping the lights on. The other thing, I don't think he's still here, but Barun was talking about, is these 3 hours of time women spend collecting fuel to cook their meals. That's 3 hours that they could be getting an education. That's 3 hours they could be doing a lot of things. The reason for worldwide illiteracy in poor countries is you don't have any time budget left. This is just a slide that talks about the structure of the California economy and how we saved energy by changing what we made. raises the fallacy of composition. If everybody in the United States was a service entity, meaning we don't make anything, then who's going to, I mean, what are they going to serve? You got to make things. This is a little bit about our real estate and construction. It's very volatile. This just talks about our weather and housing. There was an interesting article in the LA Times the other day where some mainstream environmentalist basically said, well, what you got to do is encourage development in Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco because they are the most green cities, right? Well, yeah, you got to build houses, but you got to have something for people to do there. It's already over 10% unemployment. We're going to encourage people to move to LA. How about removing the restrictions on businesses and manufacturing? The Pavley bill is what the subject of the EPA waivers lawsuit is all about. We know it's going to add about $3,000 to a car, but ARB, deputy administrator for ARB, admitted they never did any modeling as to what the effects of the Pavley bill might be. Nation cannot follow California. The few successes we've had weren't due to regulations or policy. It was just accidental. You know, we lost the aerospace industry and we came up with the internet. It didn't have anything to do with energy policy. It's all pain and it's all no gain. Now the glimmers, there are some glimmers. I don't know if you know, the few folks that are moving into California brought some sanity with them or what. I mentioned about the other Western states having second thoughts about the Western Climate Initiative. Senate Bill 295 has been introduced by Senator Robert Dutton, which would delay implementation until the economy improves as measured by unemployment and a few other things. And Assembly Bill 118 by Assemblyman Logue, which would be an outright repeal of AB 32. And I see I have just been X'd out.